Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Obviously, yesterday when I was doing the live stream was just before the Grand National took place, and obviously it was won by Sam Whaley-Coe on his last ever race. It's really, his record over those fences as an amateur, even professional jockeys would be very envious of Sam Whaley-Cohen's record of 7 wins over the national fences. That is just an outstanding achievement for any jockey. The first time winner for the trainer. It was a brilliant race, to be fair. It was raced at a fair pace. And the safety features they've introduced now for both jockey and horse with the fences has come a long way in recent years. Fantastic event. It was it went down literally to the final fence and the final sprint up to the finish line as well. Brilliant. And I haven't watched the Grand National for the last couple of years, but it was good to see packed grandstands again and fans enjoying the occasion and the day. And the race still throws up surprises, which is good to see. So a successful race, and good to see a first time start, good health, a big crowd at Aintree, good way for Sam Whaley-Cohen to end his riding career. And the fact he's an amateur means he gets none of the prize money. None of the prize money at all, and so for him it is actually just a hobby. So with all the injuries that jockeys sustain, falls, and he's a patron of the Injured Jockeys Fund. Brilliant result for him in his last ever race. Now, in other sports news, obviously Man United, the fallout from their defeat against Everton. Ronaldo's in the news for an incident involving a young fan with learning disabilities after the match. That's now making media headlines. Not a great look, but looking at some of the comments on social media, a lot of people don't understand the full situation, especially with kids who are autistic. Saying that the mother's after a bit of comp, a bit of a payout, but Ronaldo, he's one of those Marmite characters. You either love him or hate him. But the situation at Man United isn't great. There was a lot of questions in the pre-match press conference Ralf Rangnick took. Obviously, Ralf Rangnick, when he leaves the managerial position as interim, he will go into a consultancy role at the club. I think that's going to prove a problematic relationship with whoever is manager. I've said a lot of the issues at Man United are due to the structures in the day-to-day running of the club rather than necessarily. They've had some world-class managers there who can't get the job done since Ferguson. I think Ferguson, it just shows how much of a good job he was doing with the players he had available and the issues that the club has structurally since the Glazers have taken over. But there's a lot more pressure on that playing group than there was before the Everton game. Everton obviously losing to Burnley 3-2 at Turf Moor in the previous match. They are in a relegation dogfight. There's been a lot of question marks over the issues at Everton as well, and they are, possibly facing a points deduction either at the end of this season or for next season. So they're not guaranteed to be safe in the Premier League just yet, although it's looking likely that post-season they'll be docked points. So they're in real strife, and you could question whether Lampard's the right guy to be in charge. Obviously, he was an available manager, so that meant they didn't have to pay any compensation payments to get or get out clauses to get him out from a club. Man United, obviously, Erik ten Hag is the favourite to replace Ralf Rangnick in the permanent managerial position. And again, whether it's whether that works out for them is we'll have to wait and see, obviously. But looking from the outside in, whether you're a fan of the club or not, there are clearly massive structural issues that the club are facing internally with how the club is run day to day and stuff. And what is most telling is, Van Gaal, former manager, who's now in charge of the Dutch national side, said it's not a footballing club anymore; it's a commercial club, and I think that's a fair dig at the ownership and the club structures. And Louis van Gaal is a world class manager, and I think that interview he gave during the international break when he was, being asked about a question, obviously got asked about Man United because of his tenure there as manager, and I think that's an honest response. I think the issues he was facing while he was manager, the reason why they sacked him is because his style of football is not the Man United style. Well, it doesn't matter. He won a bit of silverware, and he kept them very, very competitive with what he had available. But it does tell you all you need to know about the structures of the club, and it doesn't matter what manager goes in there, they're going to face the same issues that every manager, including Alex Ferguson under the Glazers, was facing. The internal structures of the club are hampering on-field development of players. There's also issues with maintenance at the stadium and the training ground. So we'll see that. Do I think Man City versus Liverpool is now higher? It is now better than Man United Arsenal during the 90s and the 2000s. Well, Man United, I think, with the most dominant Premier League side in the first half of the Premier League era. So Blackburn and Arsenal, obviously won titles as well in that period. But Man United were pretty dominant, and there was a brief moment where Arsenal were equal, if not better than them. And it changed with the takeover by the Glazers and the Abramovich money, and that's when the landscape of the Premier League changed. Now, the Premier League came out of a breakdown in the relationship between the clubs and the EFL, the Football League, over TV money, and there was a lack of trust between the league governance and the clubs. And but the decade and a half before the Premier League, it was Liverpool's league, basically, with a handful of clubs challenging them every so often. So Nottingham Forest, Everton got a few titles in there, Aston Villa. But for the most part, the 70s and the 80s was Liverpool's period of dominance. And the 90s and the early 2000s was generally Man United's period of dominance. But other clubs would sneak in and get titles. But not on the same level of dominance. I think that's the key thing is Arsenal had a period under Wenger where they were, I think, a better side structurally and with how they played. And then the Abramovich money comes in and the Glazers take over at United, and that's the turning point in the league. It's now a far more open league than what it was. It's not a closed shop anymore, really, with Man United expected to be in the top two every season. The issue is, I would say, I think Man City Liverpool is the new Arsenal Man United. Now, whether that intensity with them battling for titles every season and being in the top two every season continues, we'll have to wait and see what happens with Chelsea. We'll obviously have to see what happens with Newcastle as well, with the financial backing they now have and the investment they now have. I think will be very, very key. The situation, I think, with Man United, I think there does come a point. I asked this question yesterday about Blackburn and how I feel about the ownership, the direction of my team. Bad ownership bad ownership can go a long way to disrupt a pretty stable club. And Man United for many, many years was stably run from the mid '80s through till 2004. The ownership was stable basically, and the investment was in the right areas, and the player development. It was a production line of talent. That isn't the case anymore. Long before the Blackburn were back in the Premier League, do you think? How long? How long? The thing is, if we're still in a playoff hunt, we're still in the promotion hunt. We're not completely out, but our form has gone off a cliff since Christmas, New Year. Look, it's been a very long time outside the Premier League. We were in League One at one point for a season. Under the current ownership, I don't see that being a sustainable goal, quite frankly. How long it takes to get back to the top table, I think new owners are required. The club has got a lot of debt and is in breach of spending rules as things currently stand. So if the EFL and the FA and the Premier League want to actually properly enforce the rules they have in place, which they're trying to do with Everton, 60 to 70 clubs would be in breach of that. The whole Championship would be a fair chunk of League One and a fair chunk of the Premier League as well. Would be in breach of spending rules of the 135% rule, where losses exceed profits. And with the Venky's as owners, I would worry if we were to go to the Premier League, it could be a massive misadventure. I don't mind the club being in the Championship, to be brutally honest. I really don't. I think Tony Mowbray's brought some stability uh, to the club, which I think was sorely needed. The owners are less interfering now than what they were before, which helps. But in the first half of their ownership, the amount of wastage financially was is crippled the club, in my opinion. Hopefully, this period of stability helps with the finances, but the first half of the Venky's ownership has been financially ruinous for the club. The debt is when they bought the club, we had no debt. Now we are saddled with it, and a lot of clubs are saddled with it. And this is where the EFL, the FA, and the Premier League have failed in regards to properly enforcing financial fair play. And this is where Alexander Serafin with UEFA has come out and said it's so easy to find loopholes around it, and so many clubs have been breaching it that if you were to properly enforce the rules, the amount of clubs that would be docked points and fined would be ridiculous. It would absolutely be ridiculous. So now clubs they brought in this new financial package of rules, which is tantamount to a spending cap. Quite frankly, it's sort of not quite a salary cap, but it's a transfer wage. It's a transfer and wages and expenditure cap. So it's sort of a spending cap in a sense to make all clubs profitable. And I think one of the reasons why it's been sped up is because clubs like Barcelona and Real Madrid and Juventus and Tottenham, the European Super League clubs are basically all bankrupt. They've lost stupid amounts of money. And so it was a sort of, we can't have the big household names fail, basically. That's basically what's urged UEFA to speed up replacing financial fair play. And the worst thing is being a yo-yo club with the lack of stability. Ask West Brom fans, Palace fans in the past, Fulham fans, I think we'll find that out next season. Peterborough fans, Championship League One. There's a lot of clubs that are too good for the league below, but not good enough for the league above, basically. And it becomes a self-fulfilling cycle of up and down, like Norwich, for example. Financially, they're really well run. Norwich is one of the best run clubs financially off the field. Very well run. They live within their means, turn a profit. However, they're not good enough in the transfer market to get the right players in to then stabilise in the league above, the Premier League in this case, and then build because they're too financially prudent. Arsenal, ironically, and I will say this, the reason why Arsenal are in the position they are now, where they're not competing for trophies regularly anymore, is they built that new stadium, the Emirates, and they spent a long time paying it off. So they were a bit more prudent in the transfer market and a bit more prudent with player salaries and player expectations for salary increases. And yes, they were a reasonably competitive side, and they did win 3 FA Cups since being at the Emirates. But on the same token, other clubs have been going, yeah, we'll just spend the money. We're going to breach financial fair play. That's the consequence of being financially prudent is other clubs will say, oh, we'll just spend money, we don't care. These new rules that UEFA are going to bring in means every club has to abide by them. They have 3 years to basically 70% of expenditure over profit. So you make more profit than expenditure, basically. 3 seasons clubs have to comply before they get hit with sanctions. They're given a bit of leeway, and there's a dropping scale of expenditure over profit. So when those rules are actually implemented and properly implemented, which they should be, you cannot therefore then go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport and have a whinge that you've been, unfairly treated, like Man City and AC Milan and PSG have done, where they just pay a fine and they make the problem go away. With these new UEFA rules coming in, that each domestic league also has to then implement, so it will be replacing financial fair play. They have to be implemented domestically as well. Clubs like Arsenal will suddenly become more competitive again because every other club has to be living within their means. So clubs like Tottenham and clubs like Man City and to a certain extent Liverpool will suddenly feel that they can't spend the big money. And Tottenham, with all their debt in relation to their stadium, that's a lot of expenditure they've accrued in recent years. They're going to feel the pinch. They're going to have to sell. The first jersey I owned was the 94-95 Blackburn Premier League winning jersey. The second kit I had was Liverpool's 97-98. I think was it Cup Winners' Cup or was it UEFA Cup? Alternate third yellow kit. I had a full kit. I had a Brazil 19, was it 74 or 78 replica? I think it was a 74 Brazil, 76. I know it was 1976 Brazil um, Copa Copa Libertadores, Copa America replica, and then I had the 2002 league winning Blackburn kit. And of course, I've got the 2006, 2007 jersey as well, and I've got um, a few other um, a few other um, a few other rugby and ice hockey and NFL and other jerseys that I've got over time. Did I watch the Australian? No, I did not watch the F1 this morning. Max Verstappen has been screwed over by engine players. New regulations. You're going to find these gremlins in with new regs when it comes to motorsport. It's just a fact. It's just a thing. It happens. When new regulations brought in, there's going to be teething issues, and the engine regulations, I think, are roughly the same. But because of the changes to the car's chassis, they've got to readjust gearboxes and engines. Reliability was a big thing in the 90s. There was a lot of regulation changes in the 90s and the early 2000s. And there was a lot of mechanical failures in the mid 90s to the mid 2000s. A lot of cars had mechanical issues. And then the cars became really, really reliable again. And it doesn't matter how much tech you have available. Uh, in theory, these cars should all be the most reliable things in the world, but they're so finely tuned that if they're slightly off, a mechanical can happen. Um, but it is what it is. I think it's because I think Red Bull are developing their engine under license, and that's different than being a factory client, for example, a customer team, because they're developing under license an old design. I think the engine regs change again in a year or two's time, so there's going to be um, further changes to the engine regulations as time's gone on with the hybrid system that the F1 regulations and the FIA have in place for them. It's the same with the British touring cars. They've come in with this new hybrid package, and there's going to be gremlins with package because the old Toka package was made in Swindon. Now it's made by BMW basically under rather than Honda because Honda have shut their Swindon plant, and BMW the M division are the ones doing the Toka package now. And you can develop your own engine, but I think every team in the British touring cars are going to be going with the Toka package because it actually costs them less money. It's a big cost um, around. But they've gone with the hybrid package. They did a test at last year's final season event, or second last season event, and the car was putting in decent lap times, but race conditions are different to test conditions. So we'll have to see how that new package and the gremlins with that. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, there was one of the privateer teams at the back of the grid tried to develop their own engine. They were kept going with this idea, and they had constant engine issues. Um, are you a big Red Bull drinker? No, I don't like Red Bull. Petrol cars around. Biofuels and hydrogen fuels, I think, are actually more. I think hydrogen and biofuels, ironically, are more sustainable than lithium batteries. The science proves that. Lithium mines are heavily toxic, and when you come to disposing of the batteries, you can't safely dispose of them because the toxins in them are bad for the environment. But Greenpeace don't seem to pay attention to open cast lithium mining and disposal because there's no safe way to dispose of lithium. It's really lithium oxide is really toxic, and the toxins. Ion batteries are a pain in the arse. So you wonder where your mobile phone batteries and car batteries go. Standard car batteries are actually ironically very easy to recycle. In comparison to if they've got a carbon or lead core, but the sulfuric acid, you can break that down with water. Did I have a go? No, I didn't actually go down and actually have a bet on the Grand National. I watched the Grand National. I thought it was actually a very good race, as I said. Good to see the crowds. Good, healthy crowds. Obviously, we've obviously had all these restrictions. In 2020, the race wasn't raced at all; it was done virtually. So it's good to see the crowds back and forth. And Sam Welly-Cohen winning on his final race as a jockey. And you've got to bear in mind he's an amateur, so he gets no prize money out of his race appearances, which a professional would get. And he's won over those fences 7 times. In the Fox Hunters, the Topham, and the Grand National. Yes, there was one horse that had to, which is actually not in the ratio. It's not I mean, some races, some Grand Nationals, there's double figures of horses that get put down. It is unfortunate. However, I prefer national hunt racing over flat racing. The horses are treated a lot better. In the flat racing, there's been allegations of these horses being pumped with steroids and other nasty chemicals. Whereas in national hunt racing, that horse might race 2-3 times a season and get regularly rest and well fed and well looked after. And for the most part, they actually live pretty decent lives as well. But yes, only one horse, unfortunately didn't make it home. Several jockeys were injured as well, which happens every race over those big fences. But yeah, no, I in regards to the F1 with engine failures, when you bring in a new set of regulations, I do believe the engine regs have changed a little bit or are going to change in another year or two. This hybrid package has seen a lot of gearbox and engine failures since it's been brought in the last couple of years. There's been a lot more mechanicals than I thought there would be, considering the technology we have available, because they are highly tuned mechanical, things. When they go wrong badly. But when they work brilliantly. But the regulations we've seen, the drivers can't go fully flat out. And even with the newer regs, they're still not being able to go flat out for 100% of the time. They've got to conserve fuel. The tyres still don't last as well as they should. And that was a fault with Bernie Ecclestone's time in charge. And to be fair, the early days of Liberty Media's time in charge was they told Pirelli to make shit tyres, and they didn't listen to driver or fan feedback. I mean, there's a reason why a lot of fans have switched off. Is you win in the pit stops rather than wheel-to-wheel racing, whereas in other sports, it is more in other forms of motorsport. It's won on the track rather than in a pit stop. That's pretty much the nuts and bolts of the issues with F1, and to a certain extent, IndyCar. Endurance racing, you're pushing the cars to the limit. You never go into fuel save mode because you have regular pit stops, but you just go flat. And then obviously it's the long endurance, so driver mistakes, so fatigue takes apart the fatigue of the vehicles. Parts will fail in endurance racing because you might have to drive 4, 12, 16, 24 hours in an endurance race. So like Le Mans, so the cars get battered, quite frankly. Whereas in F1, the race hour and a half, 90 minutes, you're done. And you can't go fully flat out. Whereas in GT racing and endurance racing, you generally are going flat out in your stint as a driver. You've got to just keep going and knocking off the lap times, and you will have regular pit stops during your stint, and then you have the driver changes. So that other driver comes in fresh, he will go flat out, and then just go regular pit stops, fuel and tyres, and he'll keep going flat because they'll work out when they can do their pit stops, and you will still have to race against cars on the track, and there is a lot of overtaking for position. Whereas in F1, the issue that F1 has had, and it's not necessarily 100% accurate to say winning the pit lane, is the regulations have made it difficult for cars to follow behind in the slipstream because of the unstable air and the aerodynamics, which is another reason why they changed the regs for this season. The gimmicky things like DRS and push and boost and push to pass and curves, you're taking away the driver's skill a little bit, which is frustrating. Same with Formula E with the boost button. Some of the gimmicky rules. So I don't like Formula E as much either. I like to see pure wheel to wheel. Doesn't matter if it's electric cars like Formula E or hybrids or petrol diesel cars or whatever propulsion system they have. I just like to see them go flat out. And the problem is F1's gone down this route of, well, the tyres aren't going to last. You can only use 100% for a limited period of laps before the tyres fall apart. And that was a massive, massive mistake of having that in the regulations for so long. Now, That was a Bernie Ecclestone decision. That was a Liberty Media decision to continue with that regulation package with the tyres. The aerodynamic regulations, yeah. Again, that was a Bernie Ecclestone Liberty, and then Liberty Media carried that on. Um, they agreed to a regulations package for X amount of years. They delayed the development of the new regs for a couple of years because Ferrari and Mercedes, well, threw their toys out the pram when they did, which obviously had an impact on delaying the new regs that we've got. Although you just had to listen to the drivers, driver feedback, participation feedback, basically. So if you are a sportsman, you've got rules in the sport. Feedback from the people who actually participate is crucial in regards to making sure you get your regulations or rules right. If there's a lot of players going, this is in a contact sport going, this is BS. We're getting this wrong. We're getting the implementation of a rule change wrong. You have to listen to them. It's the same with fans. If fans are going, you are really getting this wrong. And we're seeing it in rugby league and rugby union with some of the sin bins and red cards send offs for head contact. Um, and the use of HIA protocols and how they're being implemented. Fan feed, you're selling your product to your fan base and you're trying to encourage new fans in. And if the existing fan base is going, this is crap. What you want to do when you're on the rules committee of any sport is if a fan hasn't watched the sport for 20 years, they used to be a hardcore fan and they move to a new location where the sport isn't as popular, so it doesn't, and they come back and they watch the sport again. You shouldn't be having the question, is this what's this, rather than, oh, I remember this, I enjoyed this as a kid. You don't want to have fans going, this is not the sport I remember 5-10 years ago when I last watched it. You want to go, okay, I like the rule change, because I'm actually in favour of some of the rule changes they brought in. However, I think they brought in too many rules too quickly in a lot of sports, like the NRL and Super League. They've done too many rule changes too quickly, rather than allowing a few seasons of implementation, and then you tweak them a little bit more, and you bring another. Constantly have rule changes every season. That's not healthy for a sport at all. Um, so yeah, it is what it is there. I didn't watch the F1, as I say. I haven't even seen the highlights yet. But for me, I think F1 for me died in the mid 2010s. I was already falling out of love with it in my early 20s, if I'm being honest. Um, and part of it's just, I don't know what I think the regulations at the time and just tuned me out. I, and it, yeah, I just fell out of love with the sport. But that happens. If I was to go back and watch a full race now, I'd be like, this is not. I would say this is not the sport I grew up watching. And the same could be said for some of the changes that I see in rugby union. Rugby unions and one with the women's version of rugby union, the women's game. I find it refreshing because it's the sport I remember as a kid. The men's game in rugby union is a mess now, and unfortunately, the IR, well rugby, formerly the IRB, has allowed the scrum area to become a mess completely. That's a major area that just needs simplifying and refinement, basically. Go back to the rules as they were about 2004. Actually make the scrum half feed the ball in straight down the middle and have both hookers try and hook the ball. It's generally how scrums meant to work. So the scrum laws in rugby union are a mess completely. The tackle area is a mess. The tackle technique is shocking. If I'm being brutally honest, absolutely shocking the tackle technique that we see week in, week out in the professional leagues and in the international game on the men's side of things. There's a reason why I have to admit the amount of concussions and neck and shoulder injuries have definitely gone up. And a part of that is to do with the really poor and quite frankly shocking tackle technique that we see a lot of players implement. The head, you're always told as a junior, put your head in the right place. Now, you want to hit with your dominant shoulder. Quite frankly, don't put your head in front of the player, put it to the side of the player. So if you're right shoulder dominant, um, position yourself correctly to make the challenge. Some players have got really shocking tackle technique. A lot of players are tackling far too high. Also, the ruck and the maul. Some really bad habits like the chicken wing, for example, or wrapping around. I forget how they call it now, but clearing out where you wrap both arms up and you clear out. I mean that's crept into the game. Now, correctly and quite rightly, they are trying to stamp that out with you know punishments, sin bins for illegal head and neck contacts and ruck and mauls. But it's the last decade or so that rather nasty habit has crept into rugby union and to a certain extent rugby league as well with chicken wing tackles. And not that's one way to break your arm or dislocate your shoulder of the opposition player and cause quite a nasty career-threatening injury. And quite rightly, that's been targeted with rule changes and punishments with suspensions for players who do that. But I've noticed that the tackle technique is absolutely shocking. The good old-fashioned dominant dump tackle. It's I've seen some good tackles this weekend in the NRL, which is refreshing, but you can't tip the player. Tip tackles are just a bugbear of mine. If you get a proper dominant dump tackle, he doesn't go over the horizontal, but too many players twist their opposition body rather than just dump through. They're twisting like that, and then that's how you get shoulder and neck injuries, which can be career-ending, as we've seen. Rugby is a brutal sport, but unfortunately, bad tackle technique, be it unintentionally or intentionally, has crept into both codes, and tackling players are injuring themselves by not tackling correctly, and they're injuring their opposition as well. It's a duty of care that the tackling player has for the opposition player. We've seen some really nasty neck and shoulder. Burnley losing to Norwich, needing to win to keep up the pace with Everton. Yeah, look, I think, but part of Burnley's problem was early in the season with all the COVID issues they had and having players under protocol and couldn't field a team. They've had a very condensed schedule to catch up those games that were cancelled because of COVID, and that is catching up with them. They had a lot of games in hand. Now they have battled back from where they were, but they've basically been in the bottom three, bottom four all season. They never got their season going, and then the COVID problems hit, and they had so many games postponed that I think having a very congested second half of the season basically has caught up with that squad. Now, it's unfortunately they didn't start the season well, which has contributed to their position. At the same time, if you lose to Norwich or Watford as a manager, you're generally getting sacked this season. But Burnley dug themselves a hole before the COVID issues hit them, and they just couldn't dig themselves out. And I think that's probably what's going to cost them. Although they are playing better than Everton above them, Everton beating Man United's given them that little bit of breathing space. Now Norwich, I think Norwich are relegated, quite frankly. But yeah, no, Man United's performance from the match reports I've been reading and how the team played, pretty shocking. I'm surprised they didn't actually get a permanent replacement in for Solskjaer within a couple of weeks. I do not understand United's thinking with having a manager as an interim for 6 months. And I've got nothing against Ralph Rangnick at all, but what are the players going to play for? Quite frankly, because they know he's going to be replaced anyway. It doesn't matter. They stopped playing for Solskjaer. They stopped playing for Mourinho. They didn't stop playing for Van Gaal, but ownership took the decision not to keep him around, which I think is a mistake because he would have brought a lot of stability over the last few years. You know, they I feel sorry for how they treated David Moyes as well. I think Ferguson did stay on a bit too long, quite frankly. In my opinion, I think he stayed on a few seasons too long, even though he still won silverware towards the end of his tenure. I think Ferguson stayed on a little bit too long in his position, and I don't think it helps that Ferguson is still hanging around the club, rightly or wrongly. I mean, There's no doubt in his legacy. Um, but the situation with Man United and same with Everton is the off-field structures at the club. Plain and simple. Um, the off-field structures are killing this team. But unfortunately, the fan base got so expectant for success or battling for success every season that, unfortunately, the media's obsession with Man United is frustrating as well. There are, guess what, 19 other clubs in the Premier League that deserve attention and discussion. There's 24 clubs in the Championship, 24 in League One, and 24 in League Two. Um, Man United's biggest club, because Liverpool and Man United both had eras of dominance. Basically, Liverpool were dominant in the 70s and 80s. Man United were dominant before that, and Man United were dominant after that for a lengthy period. The issue is Manchester is the second city for the media in the UK. Quite frankly, you've got a big media presence, national and international media presence in Manchester. Same with London. So there is a lot of attention on some like the clubs in the northwest and the clubs around London. But they're not. I wouldn't say they're the biggest club. They've got one of the bigger global fan bases. It's how they branded themselves in the 90s and the 2000s in the early Premier League era. Were very, very good at selling their brand, and they've got a global following. And they're part of the reason why the Premier League became very, very successful. But they went through a period where they were in the second division at one point. They weren't always in the top flight, and they had a lengthy period without winning the league. In the 70s and 80s, they didn't win the league for 20 odd years. You could argue the Munich air disaster hampered the team going forward, and did cause problems with the team going forward. But they were in the 50s and 60s. They had a very, very good side. It was the 70s and the 80s where Man United were really struggling. This Man United side is not in the same situation that Man United was in the 70s and 80s. They were really, really struggling at times, and they were in the old second division, which is now the Championship, for a spell. And they won the FA Cup, I think, in 1984 under Ron Atkinson, or 83. I can't remember what year it was. They won the FA Cup in the 80s, and then Alex Ferguson came along in 86, and he nearly got sacked a couple of times in his first couple of seasons. The ownership were thinking about moving on from Ferguson very early on. They just adapted to the Premier League quicker than clubs like Leeds and Sheffield Wednesday and Liverpool, other big clubs at the time that were at the top of the table, and Everton. They adapted to the Premier League quite quickly, and the influx of foreign players quite well. And they had a good group of players coming through at the same time in the late 80s, early 90s. The class of 92 obviously being the famous group of youth players that all came through at the same time. So their youth system was paying off in the late 80s, early 90s, which obviously benefited the club massively with their dominant spell going through the 90s and the early 2000s. And they were very, very good in the transfer market in that period. Since the Glazers have taken over is where the issues have manifested themselves with Man United, and more so in the last decade. And it's how the club is structured, and rightly so. The Glazers have taken a lot of criticism, and it doesn't matter. It's Man United. It could be any club in the Premier League. Could have been owned by the Glazers. Quite frankly, any club could have been. You've got to think of this. Just think logically. They could own any club. But it's the structures they've implemented since buying the club. The position of Ed Woodward, great business mind, footballing mind he is not, and that's created a lot of issues. And it does show how good a job Ferguson was doing towards the end of his tenure as manager, that he was still winning trophies with that club. Because the season after he moves on, the club finishes seventh. That you can't blame it all on David Moyes, because I think Ferguson's just dominating figure. And he was such a good coach that the team was overperforming under Ferguson. David Moyes comes in, did a very good job at Everton. I'm not denying that he wasn't very good. Look what he's doing with West Ham. And the media pressure on, because there's the area of Manchester, Greater Manchester, that Old Trafford's in is near Salford, and there's a big media international media presence with the Media City in the old Salford industrial area, which is on the Salford Quays, which is similar to the Isle of Dogs in London, old Dockland area on the old canals from the industrial period. Um, and there's been a massive load of redevelopment. A lot of international and national media outlets have put secondary or primary offices in that area of Greater Manchester, and the sports media in the UK is now based out of Manchester. So automatically, Manchester United is gonna it has its own reporter. Various newspapers and TV channels have their own Man United report. Um, there are other clubs in the northwest and other clubs in English football that don't get the same attention. So when let's say I think it was Watford who beat Man United 4-1 and Solskjaer got sacked. Instead of praising Watford's performance, they were like, Man United crap. So well done Watford for doing really well. They were the upset. So there's a media bias towards a handful of clubs in the attention they get, be it positive or negative. There's a media bias on reporting, and a lot of people have kicked off about that. Now, it is what it is. So the Chelsea situation, there's a big media. Obviously, London is the capital of the UK, and there's big media presence in London. So it doesn't matter what happens with good or bad with Chelsea. A lot of attention. Arsenal, a lot of attention. Tottenham, a lot of attention. Good or bad, doesn't matter what those teams are doing. But clubs like Brentford are going under the radar with the media. Yes, they're in the same part of London as Chelsea in the sense of West London, but they're not classed as a big club, even though they're in the Premier League. They're having a really good first season in the top flight since 1948. No one's paying any attention to, which is dangerous. Crystal Palace doing really well under Patrick Vieira. They're on this long unbeaten run. Very small article for them when they beat Arsenal. It was more Arsenal are crap rather than praising Palace. They were slaughtering Arsenal because of the media bias to a more successful club with better history, apparently, even though Arsenal are not winning any trophies this season. Crystal Palace could win the FA Cup. Now, whether they get the appropriate attention to and the appropriate praise and occasionally criticism, media bias is a thing that I find frustrating when it comes to football in this country. Has Ronaldo made Man United a bet or a net better or net worse? Look, he's 36, 37. Look at his performance at the Euros last summer. It was really poor. Yeah, he scored goals. A lot of them were penalties. He was really poor in the Euros in the summer in open play. And Portugal were poor in the summer as well in open play. I would say the issues with that club are bigger than Ronaldo. I think he's complicated the situation because of the size of his ego. That's not a United dressing room. Excuse the pun with Man United. It's not a happy group of people working together. There's a lot of individuals not working together as a team, regardless who the manager is. Every manager has lost the dress. The dressing room has lost itself. Has he made them better or worse? I think players want to leave. There's players who want out. And Eric Ten Hag has said, look, he's in discussions. He's being quite frank, and he says there's going to be a clear out. So, players are on the way out. It looks like whether they want to leave or not. So we'll see. Do I think there will be some players that want to sign with Arizona next year in free agency for the money, since they might need to pay them more than other teams just to get able to play there? They are going to have to pay overs, but they're also going to draft well, and they've got some good prospects in their system. And with the salary cap as it is, with the NHL at the moment, partly because of the COVID situation that we've obviously coming out of, with the cap not going up as much as was predicted back in 2019 before the COVID pandemic, they've got a lot of cap space. So I think because of the taxes down in Arizona, and they are doing a rebuild, I think they are going to be very active in free agency. They're going to be very active in trading around the draft table, and they've been stockpiling draft picks since their punishment. With Chaker before he was fired by the organisation, and the team were punished by losing draft picks. With the trades they've been doing, they've been restockpiling those draft picks they had to forfeit. I can see them actually being very, very active in free agency and around the draft time. I can see them being very, very active, trading up and down in the draft. and I can see them being very active in free agency. They've got cap room. They have to be cap compliant. They have to hit the cap floor. They can't just put out a crap team. Um, uh, they they need to hit the cap floor. So I can see them being very very active. There's a lot of teams that are in, quite frankly, salary cap hell. Tampa, Toronto. Um, there are some teams that have got no cap space, and teams like Tampa and Toronto are really in a situation where they may not be able to extend players, and keep their squads together, their rosters together. So yeah, I can see Arizona and Seattle, amongst other teams, being very very. There's a few other teams as well that have got a fair bit of cap space coming up with players either on LTIR or retiring, that have a bit of cap flexibility, but a lot of teams do not have the flexibility. So I can see Arizona stockpiling picks and picking up a lot of free agents and trades as well. So I can see some of the stockpiling of picks they've got. I can see them trading for players as well, and I can see them definitely being better than they were this year. I think this year was a deliberate. We're starting again, but actually their form recently has been actually quite good since Christmas. Their form has been really good actually. So they actually had some pretty good form in the second half of the season. So I can see them being very active. And I think it's partly to do with, and what helps them is that the taxes in Arizona have been quite favourable. Um, we've noticed Arizona and Texas and Florida-based teams, Carolina, because the taxes are quite favourable. They can actually do a lot in free agency. There's a reason why Phil Kessel is in Arizona. He was offered quite a good deal, and he gets to take home more of his money. Um, that's where I think Arizona can be quite successful in free agency. I think they won't necessarily have to overpay to get players down there. It's a favourable climate. They've got a good core of young players coming through, which is always a positive sign if you're a veteran player or a senior player. Um, having a good group of youngsters coming through at the same time, so that's always an entice to entice a more senior player over. Um, so there is that. Kabaddi. Hell's Kabaddi? Never heard of Kabaddi before. There's a lot of these niche sports that I've never heard of before that I really need to look up. Kabaddi. Let's have a look. But no, I mean the BBC. Some of the things the BBC does do quite well is finding those niche sports for a couple of seasons, and then they don't kick on with it, um, which is a problem. Let's have a look at Kabaddi. Let's have a look what this sport actually is. Kabaddi is an Indian team sport. Oh, I see. I see. Sort of like British Bulldog. Okay, it's been at the Olympics in 1936 as a demonstration sport. Didn't know that. It's an Indian contact team sport with origins in the Tamil region, which is southern India. Um, Costa Rica, I think, will beat New Zealand in their playoff match to make the World Cup. I think Costa Rica will do it. They've got better players who play at a higher level in their domestic football. Ah, yeah, Kabaddi's sort of similar to um, British Bulldog. Um, oh yeah. Well, we do have a big subcontinental second and third generation immigrant population in this country, so I'm not surprised it's actually very very popular um, over here within those communities. Um, but no, yeah, I know it's news, but I think Costa Rica will have too much for New Zealand simply because of the leagues that their players play in are of a higher quality. A lot of the Costa Ricans, there's a lot of Costa Ricans who do play in Mexico, for example, and in Europe historically. I think that there's more Costa Rica. A lot of their players play in the MLS as well. Is there a specific style of play that the Caribbean nations exhibit? The Central American nations are very similar to the South Americans and the Mexicans in the sense that they've got good technical ability, and they're exceptionally fit. Their fitness is key, and a lot of their better players end up playing in Europe, at European clubs, which means they experience a higher level of skill and organisation and coaching, which then they can implement with their national sides. Um, so they've got that kind of South American and Mexican influence when it comes to technical skill and that kind of flair style of play. They're very good technically on the ball. They Latin American football, South American or Central American there's a good technical ability, and sometimes defence is sort of their weakness. They're very open in attack, um, but some of the Central American countries, baseball is actually more popular than football. But I think Costa Rica, with the higher level of quality and their more experience, being regularly appearing at World Cups, I think the Costa Ricans will have too much for New Zealand. Partly because football in New Zealand is a minor sport, basically. Both codes of rugby and cricket, they're world class, and football they have very few professional players playing in the A League and around the world. So it's a very niche sport in New Zealand. It doesn't get the same exposure and coverage that both codes of rugby and cricket get, where they are world class in other team sports. And for a small population size that New Zealand has, the fact that they can be, some of the best teams in the world when it comes to some of the international sports that have global reach, like both codes of rugby and cricket, the small population size tells you how sports mad New Zealand is. But it's a problem. They don't have the talent depth that Costa Rica does. There's more registered Costa Rican players, more talent depth. Um, so that is what it is. Kabaddi. I mean, I think that's where British Bulldog sort of comes from a little bit. Is Kabaddi? It's one of those niche, but yeah, again, I think it's interesting that there is that kind of interest in the sport. It is a niche sport, and outside of the Indian subcontinent, obviously, it's not very popular. But you've got to think the countries that have that play it globally, that have national sides. There's a big Indian and Pakistani and Bangladeshi, immigrant population in the US. In Canada, there's a massive Indian population. Obviously over here we've got a big Indian and Pakistani and Bangladeshi population. So I'm not overly surprised that we have a national side and we have a national league. Why the BBC have picked it up, I don't know. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, the fact it's a demonstration, it has been a demonstration sport at the Olympics in the past, says that there's enough people playing it globally for it to become an Olympic sport at some point. I think that's the idea of having demonstration sports at the Olympics, demonstration events. But it is one of those niche sports that would have more limited appeal. I'll have to obviously watch some. I'll have to obviously watch some on YouTube and the BBC Sport website and have a little look at it and try and understand how it all works. But when you have like established, as I say, this is where like I think it looks good for them getting Asians playing sport fundamental. Yeah, I mean, look, as I said about with surveys done in regards to sporting participation, post education. Um, uh, yeah, certain minority groups and socioeconomic groups have a higher drop off than others when it comes to continuing being, sportingly active, be it an amateur or professional, or watching and participating. So it is an interesting one. But I've got lots of Indian and Pakistani friends, and not one of them has ever mentioned Kabaddi to me. So I think it's still a little bit niche in their community as well, to a certain extent, because I've never heard of any of my friends mention it. They talk about cricket, they talk about martial arts, football. Oh yeah, I do Kabaddi. Never come across it. Any predictions or thoughts on City Liverpool? Am I going to watch? I don't have Sky, BT, or Amazon, so I'm not going to watch that. And B, I think Klopp, the way Liverpool set up tactically, can counteract City's style of play, and I think they are very evenly matched sides. And Klopp has got a very good record against Guardiola in the Premier League. All time, Guardiola has the edge on Klopp, but Klopp is one of those few managers who can tactically outthink Guardiola. That's the interesting thing um, about things. How popular is it in Asia? I know. Well, the Tamil region of India is the south and the west coast, southwestern coast, and the tip of India. And the Tamil culture obviously is in Sri Lanka as well, as the Tamil ethnic group. So it's already regional in India. It's not like it's played all over India because I've got Sri Lankan and Indian and Pakistani friends. If it's the Tamil um, region of India or the Tamil culture, that they are a minority group in India. They're not, and then they're very regional in India and Sri Lanka. So already that makes it a minority sport in India as well. So and I've never had any of my Indian or Pakistani or Sri Lankan friends ever mention anything to do with kabaddi before. I think it is a bit more of a niche minority sport even in India. Um, but India is a big country with a big population, so to be classed as a minority niche sport there, you still got to have millions of people participating in on a regular basis with said sport. The fact that we have a national side in it, we won a medal in it. Um, Again, why doesn't the mainstream media go and add more praise? You know why? Because there is a media bias towards certain sports in this country, and we know what those sports are that get all the media attention. And I think that's the problem with the British media, and I'm not a big fan of the British mainstream media. I think it's quite toxic with a lot of their reporting. There's a lot of bias in their reporting, especially with sport. Um, India has Kabaddi Pro League. It's probably their fourth most popular league after cricket football. Um, I would say so. Field hockey is the most popular sport in India. Cricket's the second most popular, and they're well classed at that. And on a global scale, they win World Cups and Olympic and Commonwealth medals in those sports. So they are, you know, when you've got a population of 1 billion people, to be classed as a minority sport, I don't know how many Tamils there are in India. I think it's about 100 million Tamils in India and Sri Lanka combined, or something like that, who have Tamil ancestry. So you're looking at a minority of the population in India. But in regards to cricket and field hockey, yeah, India it's mad. I would say I'm not saying it's not popular, but my knowledge of the Indian ethnic groups and tribal history and the nationalities that make up India, because India's a vast country with multiple different cultures, is not as extensive as, let's say, discussing European, historical groups and nationalities. India is a vast country, massive country, and the reason why Pakistan and Bangladesh exist is the partition in 1948, which was a shocking moment in British colonial history, which forcibly moving like 300 million people of Muslim or Hindu or Sikh faith. Um, and then the resultant split between East and West Pakistan, which became East Pakistan became Bangladesh, and the forced movement of millions and millions of people, and the redrawing of the map and the issues in the Kashmir and stuff. Um, the partition of India is a dark moment in Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi history. It's a dark moment in British colonial history. It's not a it's a very dark time, and it's got a lot. There's still a lot of social divisions because of that. Um, in regards to it being quite popular, yeah, I have no doubt that it is. On a global scale, very few nations have participation in it, and that's where sports like football and rugby union and cricket obviously have that global appeal with World Cups and it's played all around the world, and then rugby league to a certain extent. You know, it's not just participation; it's also fans of said sport. So um, other sports have more participation and fan viewership and a more global appeal, if that makes sense. And there's a reason why um, football and rugby union are far ahead. Yes, obviously, look, we gave them cricket and field hockey, and they're better at it than we are. We invent the sport, we give it to them, and they get better at it than we are. Britain's very good at it. We invent a lot of things, other countries make it better. Um, I mean, the conditions for cricket and field hockey are perfect in India. and they really are for playing the sport. And they just produce world class talent in both sports that we just cannot replicate. Um, and it's just amazing how we invent the bloody sport for cricket, and they're better at it than we are by a long way. We are nowhere on the same level as India right now. Yeah, there are reasons like why certain sports that us Europeans play and Northern Hemisphere and like things like rugby and football, rugby league, and ice hockey, they don't play in India. It's the conditions. Um, Apart from the monsoon, everything's flooded, so you can't play a lot of team sports because you'll be up to your waist in water. And then the rest of the year, it's arid and dry, which means you can't get that grip with your in the ground. In ice hockey, you've got to spend a lot on air conditioning and making sure the climate control. And India gets bloody hot, so that's a very expensive sport to do. No, actually, India does actually have an ice hockey team, and so do Iraq as well, and Iran have ice hockey team. Weird. You wouldn't think that play in the IIHF. They do, but it's a very uh, the climatic conditions suit cricket because it's dry for lengthy periods of the year, so you don't get rain delays. So you can play day-night tests and all sorts. The climatic conditions in India are more conducive to playing cricket because you don't have bad light, you don't have rain delays, because the majority of rain happens in the monsoon. Outside the monsoon season, it barely rains in India for 9 months. Perfect climatic conditions for playing. Rugby and football, you need a lot of water to the pitch, and if you're in a very arid country and water is a lifeblood for these people, you can't waste it. So that's probably one of the reasons why football and rugby didn't take off in India, where in other parts of the European colonial empires they did. Um, um, but if they do like physical sport, I mean, don't get me wrong. As I said, when I was at school, the Indian and Pakistani and Bangladeshi kids, they obviously enjoyed playing sport, but they didn't have the passion for rugby and football. They loved watching it as fans, but playing it wasn't really in their culture. Cricket, field hockey, they were the best players we had. You couldn't get them off the field. They wanted to keep playing. So it's a cultural thing as well. Why does bring jersey numbers be more important of an American thing than European? It's sporting culture. Obviously, um, sporting culture. Testimonials, which is what we generally do in Europe, is have that testimonial for a former player or players, like charity matches and stuff, where if they played for 10 years, you get a testimonial. If you have had a certain amount of appearances for a team, you'll get a testimonial. When you retire, if you've been a player who's played in the league for a very, very long time or played the sport for a very long time, you'll get a testimonial. Play for a club for 10 years, you get a testimonial. It's generally how it works. Jersey retirement, because it's the franchise versus club system. Rugby union, when you start in, you get 1 to 15, regardless of your name on the back or not. Rugby league, starting line at 1 to 13 or 1 to 17 for your starting bench. If you've got a squad player got to come in, you'll have a match day squad of 24, depending on league rules, and you just get your jersey number. So if you're playing in a fullback, you're going to be wearing number 1 in rugby league or number 15 in rugby union. So you don't have the jersey retirements. Football, to a certain extent, certain numbers, squad numbers, you're allowed to select a squad number. Certain players might have a very unique number, like 97 or something like that. Retiring shirt numbers is as much as 6. Jaromir Jagr 68. They are, because you can select your squad number from 1 to 99 in American franchise sports. Obviously, when a jersey is retired, you've still got a choice of nearly 100 numbers to choose from. It's not a European thing. European thing is giving a player a testimonial send off. That generally happens if you play for a club for 10 years. If you hit so many X amount of 100 appearances, or if you're a long-serving player in the sport, you get a testimonial, which is generally a charity match, and you get sent off, and there's special awards given out. Testimonials are kind of fun. But yeah, no, retiring shirt jersey numbers is an American thing. It's not a European thing. But you know, when you get certain milestones, you'll be able to lead your team out first. So if you hit 100, like 50, 100, 150, 200, 250, that kind of thing. When you hit those every 50 games, or you break the appearance record, you'll be allowed to lead your team out first, even if you're not the captain. Something that European and Australian sports do quite a bit is, yeah, if you are hitting 50, every 50 appearances, you get to lead your team out. If you've broken the club record, you get to lead your team out generally. And occasionally, if you're a debutant, you get to go out first you get to lead the team out occasionally. But for the most part, unless you're actually breaking a league or club record after those milestone appearances, no real big fanfare, really. All be told, if you hit a points record, sometimes a big, a big celebration on the big screen. Uh, the Yankees have 22 numbers retired. There can't be a single digit number anymore. Yeah, it's a weird one. Um, I don't get that really. Uh, but I understand that the older, I mean, there has to come a point where you have to unretire the number, but keep the name in the rafters with the number they wore, and allow someone else to have the number, because you're going to run out of squad numbers eventually if you constantly have jersey retirements. Um, yeah, at some point, you'll have to unretire the number, and then, but still have the name and number on the rafters. There'll have to come a point where you go, well, we've run out of squad numbers. What's the guy going to have? But yeah, it's weird. You can't have the number 0 and you can't have the number 100. But yeah, like you will see in training jerseys, it will tell you what number player they are in how many players have gone before when they have their first appearance. They're registered as. Some teams will say, "Oh, I'm let's say Melbourne Storm, Cameron Smith. He was one of the first. He was not the first player to play there, but he was in the first couple of years of the team being. The team was founded in '98. He made his debut in 2002. It might say Cameron Smith underneath training number 50 or something. He was the 50th person to get a cap, make an appearance. So there is that. Not as bad as retiring Jude Bellingham number. Yeah, I understand like testimonials and charity matches and appearance where you've hit like so many appearances for the club or professional appearances, you get a lead your team out and you know uh, or walk out first in front of a packed stadium. I get that. Breaking an international appearance record, that kind of thing is very special. But we don't do jersey retirements unless it's ice hockey. Ice hockey is the only sport where you get to choose your jersey number in Europe. But North America, it's what it is. We're not really big on the Hall of Fame style of things either. Whereas the North Americans are big on like Hall of Fame, nominations and inductees. We're not massive on that in European. It's just the sporting culture is different. That's generally what it is. The sporting culture is just generally different. Just how it goes. There's no maliciousness behind it or anything like that. It's just the sporting culture from Europe to North America is different, and is my view on it. I've done a video on the difference between the difference in sporting culture between North America and Europe. I stand by that. It's just the sporting culture is generally different. I it's it, I'm not a big fan of like Hall of Fames and the criteria to enter. A Hall of Fame criteria and the criteria to get your jersey retired or your name put up in a banner or something. Because I honestly believe that from era to era, the start, especially in ice hockey, I'm a massive ice hockey fan. There are players in the Hall of Fame that wouldn't get in now, and there are players who should be in that aren't. and how they work out the criteria for a goaltender or a player to enter the Hall. It's a head scratcher for me. I think players like Shane Doan should be in the Hall of Fame because he played his entire career with one team, and I would put him down in the builder category. I think other players. I mean, Jaromir Jagr is going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. There's no doubt on that. But it's what it is. Cujo, Curtis Joseph, not being in the Hall of Fame. Is it because he didn't win a Stanley Cup? One of the best goaltenders in NHL history. I think one of the best not to win. Roberto Luongo didn't win a Stanley Cup. I think he should be in the Hall of Fame. I think Marc-Andre Fleury should be in the Hall of Fame. But Grant Fuhr is in the Hall of Fame, but his save percentage is shocking. But he won a lot of Stanley Cups. What is the entrance criteria to get put in the Hall of Fame and get that special kind of, what is the criteria? Because they're for me, I think if you've played like 1,000 games in the NHL, you should automatically be considered. If you've played your entire career with one team, I think you should be considered. Because that's very rare these days. I don't know. Osborne culture is more linked with the Commonwealth rather than Northern Europe. I wouldn't say necessarily that. European sporting culture is generally the same across Europe with the club dynamic, where the club is part of the community and it has a big community economic and social impact on the community. That is a European thing and a South American thing to a certain extent because of the waves of European immigration. Same with Australia to a certain extent. There's a lot of community involvement with clubs. The franchise system is a North American system, and their way of running sports teams is different. Their sporting culture is different. The NCAA has the collegiate sports have a big TV deal, makes the colleges a lot of money, very popular on the TV networks. So they have a completely different sporting culture. I'm not saying there's anything right or wrong with that. Have evolved and developed. There's no promotion, relegation. Teams relocate quite regularly. I think the Oakland Raiders are the latest team to do a relocation to Vegas. So if the owner doesn't like locating, I'm not making a lot of money here, or we're having issues with the stadium, we'll just move the team. They have lost the sport. Without us, Great Britain or England has never been the world champions of basketball, volleyball, handball, or futsal. True, but we do have volleyball teams, we do have basketball teams, we do have handball. It's just our national sports, football, rugby, and cricket, rugby league. Obviously, we just developed those sports. They became quite popular, and then we exported those sports overseas. We are an outdoor sporting nation. Other countries, especially post World War II, and this is I think the key thing. Most European countries post World War II were doing a lot of reconstruction, and obviously there was a lot of ordnance lying around, bombs and all that, and they had to do more reconstruction of their countries than we did, and there was a big emphasis put on. And if you look at like a French school, for example, not a lot of playing fields. Italian schools, not a lot of playing fields. They have sports halls, and with the rebuilding that had to happen in Europe, they put a lot of investment in the Olympic sports, and basketball being an Olympic sport, handball being an Olympic sport. They put a lot of investment in getting their populations fit and healthy again, and the communities had a lot of involvement with rebuilding their communities. And of course, the American money comes in through the Marshall Plan, and basketball and things like that. A lot of the indoor sports are very popular in North America, and with the amount of rebuilding and trying to rebuild towns and cities, there's a lot of emphasis when it comes to education as well as community on on sports that can be played indoors as well. So and space and availability and funds and infrastructure, there was a lot of emphasis put on with education. A lot of schools in Europe don't have massive playing fields like we do, and a lot of their PE, as we would call it here, or sport, done indoors. And a lot of European countries, it gets very cold in winter. You don't want to be outside in winter, freezing with a continental European winter. It gets very, very cold. Keep the kids indoors. So that's where indoor sports really kick off in Europe. Is because in winter it gets very, very cold in Europe, continentally, and they go. And also, you take out the impact that weather has on the weather conditions have massively. And when you do that, the heat or the cold, you can control the climate, and therefore you take the weather conditions out of. Unless of it's heavy rain or too hot outside, you're inside a building, you're sheltered from the conditions, and you can participate. Uh, Daniel Alfredson, yeah, I think that is a definite for me. I think he should be in the Hall of Fame. Um, I think the Sedin twins should be in the Hall of Fame. Um, I think a lot of players who played should be in the Hall of Fame, but I don't know what the entry criteria is. Um, the the issue is the Senators haven't been a consistent playoff team, so he doesn't have as many playoff appearances as other players do with playoff appearances. Does Daniel Alfredson, which is a problem. But I do think he should be in the Hall of Fame. Nicholas Cromwell should be in the Hall of Fame. But it is what it is. I think again, I don't know how the criteria works. I think Curtis Joseph should be in the Hall of Fame. And Roberto Luongo should be in the Hall of Fame. But again, you know, it is what it is. How what the criteria are for entering the NHL Ice Hockey Hall of Fame is. I mean, ice hockey, you have the International Hall of Fame as well, and National Halls of Fame, but the NHL Hall of Fame, it doesn't take into account those years that players spent in the WHA. That's not kept in the NHL record books. They ignore that completely, which is frustrating because some great players spent a lot of their careers in the WHA as well, lengthy spells of their playing careers in the WHA, and therefore have less NHL appearances, which counts against them when it comes to Hall of Fame consideration in the 70s. So that has to be thought about as well. But yeah, I don't know what the criteria are now to enter because now you have 32 teams, you're less likely to win the Stanley Cup as a player than you were in the 80s when there was 21 teams. So how that impacts the criteria for entry, it's harder to make the playoffs. It's harder to win the Stanley Cup. No player's going to have a 32-year lengthy career, apart from Jaromir Jagr and Gordie Howe as exceptions. So if there was a new winner every season, there'd be a player who could be 18 now. If every NHL franchise won one Stanley Cup per season, it would take 32 seasons, as things currently stand, to win a Stanley Cup. You have a 1 in 32 chance every season of winning the Stanley Cup as a player. Whereas 30 years ago, you had a 1 in 21 chance of winning the Stanley Cup at the start of the season. So it's harder to win a Stanley Cup now. It's harder to win the Stanley Cup as well because of the salary cap. So you're less likely to have a dominant team like the Oilers, the Islanders, the Canadians. I mean, the Blackhawks and the Tampa Bay Lightning have given it a go, and the Penguins have given it a go in recent times. Detroit gave it a go as well, but it is harder to win back to back. It's harder to be a dominant team over a 10-year period. So it is harder to win Stanley Cup. It is harder to win those individual awards as well because there's now more players in the league that you have to compete against for the Vezina, for the Lady Byng, for the Masterton, for the the goal scoring for the Rocket Richard, it is harder to win those individual awards as well because you now have more players to play against as your contemporaries. So automatically, it becomes even harder to enter the Hall of Fame. And so you have to bear that in mind as well. It's an interesting one. I don't know how they work out the criteria as well, the balloting criteria, and how you enter as first ballot or second ballot. The entry criteria. There are some people in the Hall of Fame who possibly shouldn't be there, but it was easier to win the Stanley Cup. It was easier to win what is now the Rocket Richard because you're playing against less players to compete for those individual awards, like the Lady Byng and the sportsmanship and the Masterton and the Vezina. You're going head to head against less players because there were less teams. So automatically, it's harder to win now than what it was. There's 11 more teams now than what there was in 1990. So in the space of 32 years, 11 more teams have been added to the league. In 1966, there were 6 teams. In 1967, there were 12. So from what we call the expansion era from 67 onwards, and then the modern expansion era from 1991, 92 onwards, there was a period when the WHA teams came in and the league expanded, and there was some expansion in the 70s as well. And in 1979, the WHA collapses, and 4 teams come over from the WHA, 4 franchises, which are still active franchises in the league right now. And by the end of the 80s, there was no expansion. So you've got 21 teams. 16 teams make the playoffs. So you had to be really bad to miss the playoffs then. An average side can make the playoffs. And now you have 32 teams. So it's harder to win the Stanley Cup. It's harder to win the individual awards. It's probably harder to reach 1,000 games now because of salary cap and things like that. The league's getting younger and faster, so automatically things have become more difficult for individual players to be considered for jersey retirement, Hall of Fame, that kind of thing. But I don't know how the criteria work. I'm going to have to look at the Hall of Fame entry criteria. First ballot, second ballot. Some are made on third ballot. Consideration for each Hall of Fame class, and they are limited to how many can be inducted per year in the Hall of Fame class as well. So automatically, the way the sports are structured, with more teams, more professionals, the league being bigger than what it was. It is what it is. Obviously, so I think it's harder to get in the Hall of Fame now than what it was. And I think there are some players who have retired in the modern era who, had they been playing 20 years before, would have been in the Hall of Fame. And there are some players that were playing in the earlier eras when there were less teams and it was easier to win, and you had less players to compete against for the individual awards, who shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame if we're going by standards. And there is a debate about getting Curtis Joseph and Roberto Luongo in the Hall of Fame. And with their win records in the NHL's goaltenders, but they haven't won any Stanley Cups. The amount of Vezinas they've won. Craig Anderson will not make the Hall of Fame, even though he's won 300. He's now hit the 300 win mark. He's never won the Vezina. He's only, I think, won 2 individual awards. So, and he's been a long-time servant of the sport, and he's played on some really bad teams in that time. There's how do you quantify what is a Hall of Famer? There are some players playing right now that will be first ballot Hall of Famers. Ovechkin, Crosby, they will automatically go in the halls within when they have that mandatory 3 years from retirement. They'll be first ballots straight away. Jaromir Jagr, first ballot straight away, and he's still playing in the Czech Republic. That's what's scary. He's still, even though the Czech league is not as physical and it's a different style of play, he's still playing professionally in his 50s. And if he hadn't gone to the KHL when he did, I think, look at his numbers, they're terrifying. He's one of the best players ever to play the game. And he's a first ballot. no doubt on that. He's a first ballot Hall of Famer. And it's just a question of when he decides to go, I'm hanging up the skates. Ryan Getzlaff, I think he may go in the Hall of Fame. I say that may. I'm not sure if he necessarily will, but he has won a Stanley Cup, and he's played his entire career with Anaheim. We'll have to wait and see if Ryan Getzlaff, after his eligibility period comes up, whether he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. But he's announced he's retiring at the end of the year. But there are some good players out there who've missed out on Hall of Fame consideration for a variety of reasons. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that eligibility system works and what makes you Hall of Fame eligible. What kind of criteria is, and I do believe with the lockouts we've had, the 3 lockouts we've had have affected some players' totals. Like Shane Doan, he didn't make 1,000 games, and the 2004-2005 lockout, I think, possibly cost him a Hall of Fame nomination. And there's a question mark whether he does belong in the Hall of Fame. And I think he does. Personally, I think that he does deserve that kind of consideration as a builder, the building category, because he spent his entire career with one organisation and one of the longest serving captains in NHL history. And he stuck with the team when he could have been, moved on. He could have not had contract extensions. He took below market value on his contracts, and he stuck with a team through good and bad. And he played until his early 40s. I think Shane Doan belongs in the Hall of Fame. Is there a bit of Arizona bias from me? A little bit. He's one of my favourite players. I do think, obviously, that the 2004-2005 lockout cost a few players that 1,000 games played mark, which I think is one of the criteria to get in. In saying that, I think he does deserve to be in the Hall of Fame under the builder category. I think there's a fair few players who've played. I think the Sedin twins deserve to be in there. Again, playing their entire careers in Vancouver. Again, there is that debate. They didn't win a Stanley Cup, but they did play a Stanley Cup final. But I think they deserve to be in there. I think a lot of players deserve to be in there that aren't, and there are some players in there who, when they were playing, it was easier to win the Stanley Cup because the league was smaller. It was easier to win those individual awards because the league was smaller in number of teams, and so therefore you've got less players to go head to head against for award nominations. But the sport has evolved. Comparing eras is subjective because the game is faster, quicker paced. It's harder to score now than what it was in the 80s. We've gone through the dead puck era where scoring really dropped off. There's less penalties now than what there were before. You've got a salary cap, which makes it harder. The fact that they're also discussing a Premier League Hall of Fame, I hope not. But we have had some great players play in the Premier League. But I'm not. It's just not in the sporting culture of Europe to have Hall of Fame kind of things. But I do like sporting museums. Sporting museums, really interest me. I want to go see the hockey museum in Toronto, and I want to go see the Stanley Cup in Toronto in the International Hockey Museum. I do want to go see the Football Museum. I want to go see the various sports museums that are out there. I do want to go to Goodwood, see Glorious Goodwood. I do want to see all these sporting museums. Simply because it's part of our social history, and it's a big thing. There are some. You look at some of the trophy rooms that some of the clubs have with the historical trophies they've won. Why is it so hard for guys to get in the Hall of Fame? That is a good question. Very good question. Obviously, Patrick Roy and Martin Brodeur are, first ballot Hall of Famers. But Curtis Joseph and Roberto Luongo on the wins list, all-time wins list, I think they deserve to be in there. Um, I mean, Dominic Hasek came to the NHL quite late in his career in comparison to others. I don't know. It is harder for goalies. It is a lot harder for goalies, I think. Um, why is it so hard? I couldn't tell you. I don't know what the criteria are for a goaltender to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. I really couldn't tell you. I think it's not fair that Cujo isn't in there. He was a great servant to the sport. A great ambassador for the sport. Uh, honestly, if you listen to his backstory, if you read read up on his growing up, he was a foster child, much like Grant Fuhr. He was fostered. Um, he was adopted, and he had a very difficult childhood. And to do what he's done in the sport without winning a Stanley Cup, absolutely. I grew up watching Cujo. I've got a lot of time to listen to his interviews and read up on him and watch his highlights. But he didn't win a Stanley Cup, and I don't know the criteria to enter, because there are some goalies on that list of the wins list who I think should be. I think Roberto Luongo should be. I think Cujo should be. And they're not in the Hall of Fame. And you know, uh, it's a difficult one because they are judged on the individual Vesna and Stanley Cup. And their save percentage goes a long way as well, and playoff appearances and the wins column. But there are some goalies in the Hall of Fame who've won less games than Cujo and Luongo, quite a few actually. But they didn't win that Stanley Cup. And then you look at how many Vesnas, how many times they're in Vesna consideration. Will Carey Price be in the Hall of Fame? There you go. Will Carey Price make the Hall of Fame? Because his contract is a disaster for Montreal. That contract is this is where this is an argument against having salary caps in certain leagues, because bad contracts really hamper team development and putting a good team together. And this is an argument against having salary caps if you want to have a competitive team. If you're at one or two bad contracts and you can't shift them, it does limit what you can do as a coach and what you can do as a director of sporting operations or a general manager when you're putting a team together and you want to assemble a squad that can be competitive. If you've got a contract like Carey Price's at Montreal, I know he's off LTIR. That's a big chunk of the salary cap going on one player, and it's the same with Toronto. I know Austin Matthews is having a fantastic season, but it does it it does hamper the squad you can put together to keep cap compliant. It really does. When you've got one or two or three, or in Toronto's case, you've got 4 or 5 players that take up half your salary cap. It does limit the supporting cast and the depth players you can put around them to make sure that team is competitive. And while Austin Matthews is having a brilliant season, but individual standards, the way the team is constructed is too heavily weighted around a handful of players. And with a salary cap that they're going to have to make some tough decisions going forward with contract extensions and trades. Craig Anderson is 18th on the all-time list. He's not on the save percentage, saves. He's not on the win list that high. He's lower down the win list. But he's got 300 wins. Now he's past 300 wins, which is very hard to do, by the way. But he's never won a Vezina, I don't think. I think he's won is it the Masterton? He's won an individual award. I think it's the Masterton Trophy. And he's been in Vezina conversation a few times, but he's never actually won a Vezina and he's never won a Stanley Cup. So while he's got a great save percentage all time and he's got those 300 wins, he's not even close to Hall of Fame consideration. Cujo isn't in there and Luongo isn't in there. Any consideration, he won't be in there. Um, but he shows what it is to be dedicated to your craft and stick at it. He could have given up, played in Europe, gone down to the AHL and just got a small paycheck and lived comfortably. He stuck at it when you know the media were going, "Oh, he's not good enough." He did stick at it, and he's still playing and he's still contributing, and he might want to go one more season. Um, and if you are a Senators fan, you know there's a lot of fond memories for Craig Anderson. A lot of fond memories of some, what he had to play through with his wife being seriously ill, battling cancer. He would play a game and then fly straight away to be with his wife. He had to miss games because his wife was seriously ill. He's got a young family. I mean, that it doesn't matter what job you do if you've got to deal with that mentally. It's you know I think that emboldened the team around him, and and I think it gave him a lot of strength having the team bust the gut for him. And that's got to mentally take it out of you. And I think Craig Anderson, he's not the best goalie, no, he's not. But is he one of the most dedicated to his craft? Yes, he is. Yes, he is. Um, and he's played for some bad teams, some bad teams statistically, which makes it harder to win games and get a winning record for the season and a 500 record for the season. But I tell you now, he is definitely dedicated to what he does. He's a consummate model professional. There's not many. I don't think there's any negatives about Craig Anderson's application, his attitude, who he, his personality. No one's got a bad word to say about him. Consummate professional. He stuck at it when he could have called it a day, called it quits. He's a good veteran to have in a dressing room, in the locker room, around some of the young players. Good veteran presence to have, which a lot of teams I think are lacking. With the obsession to get younger and faster, some of these veterans to have around, even if they're not playing key minutes, are very important for a side. He's got a good playoff record. His playoff numbers are actually really, really good when the team he plays for does make it to the playoffs. He has a really good save percentage in the playoffs, and I think it's above 500 record in the playoffs. He has a winning record in the playoffs for games played and wins, and he's made the 300 win mark. It took him a long time to get there, but he did play behind some very bad teams. He's played on some non-playoff teams, but the media gave up on him. Several teams have given up on him in the past, which I think is unfair. I think players develop at different rates, and to play in the NHL, you're in a very small percentage of players who ever play the game. To reach that top level and play just one game, let alone win 300 of them as a player. And to be 18th all time on the all-time saves list for saves made, um, that in itself, uh, you know, is something. And he's definitely played the game in the right way. He's highly thought of by his teammates that he's played alongside and the opposition players who played against him. He's a very highly thought of within the sport, within the league. He's very well respected. And he could be one of those guys who makes a very, very good coach. I honestly believe he could make a very, very good coach, an assistant or a head coach at some point. Um, his dedication to the sport and his craft is second to none. The fact that you know, um, there are other goalies a lot better than him for wins and appearances and Stanley Cups and Vesnas. Doesn't matter. I think to play at that level for as long as he has, you've got to be dedicated. And he's had injuries, and he's had various GMs and coaches give up on him. He's been traded. He's played for a lot of teams. He's played on some bad teams. Um, he's currently with Buffalo, and they are a disaster. 11 straight seasons without playoffs is now a league record for failure, a record that no team wants. And I can't see Buffalo making the playoffs next year either. Uh, that's a generation of failure, um, for Buffalo. And he's still willing to to put in the performances week in, week out, night in, night out, turn up to training, and he's in his 40s, and he's had a very, very long career. I mean, he was drafted before the 2004-2005 lockout. That's how far. I think he was drafted in 1999. I think he was drafted over 20 odd years ago. So he's been playing in the NHL for a very, very long time. He's been playing professionally for a very, very long time. That length of career on its own, and the challenges faced. Yeah, I think Buffalo as an organisation, I don't understand why it's been 11 years without any kind of playoff appearance. That is generally troubling at this point. And how you fix the situation with the Buffalo Sabres, I don't know. I really don't know. They have been bad for a long time, mediocre to bad for a very, very long time. The fact they've had this lengthy spell outside the playoffs, and it's now a record-breaking spell outside the playoffs. I don't think they get the playoffs next season either, which will be 12 seasons without playoff a playoff appearance, and that is generally troubling. And the fan base is fanatical to a fault; they're loyal to a fault. But there's now starting to be signs that, yeah, fans are staying away. The frustration is building. They've had a lot of coaching changes. They constantly a lot of trades. They tanked to get McDavid, then up with Eichel, good player. He's now gone and moved on from the team. So their franchise player's gone, which they got Rasmus Dahlin, and he's a very good player. But will he be willing to stick out this mediocrity for a long period of time? We've got Ristolainen. Will he be willing to stick out this mediocrity? It's a goalie graveyard in Buffalo. Goalies go there to destroy their careers, it seems. I don't know how you fix the situation. They've had coaching changes, GM changes. The amount of players, the player turnover is ridiculous. And they've had some good players play for them. They've had some very good sides in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They had some very, very good teams. They've made Stanley Cup finals. They've, had some good playoff runs. I mean, Dominic Hasek, he's a Hall of Famer. They've had Hall of Famers play for them. I do not understand why it is so bad. And I know, the Bills Mafia and the fanatical Buffalo fan base that there is, and they get a lot of Canadian fans from across the border, support Buffalo teams as well. The Bills, they have the worst Super Bowl record, but they got to consecutive Super Bowls, I think, for 3 or 4 years or something, and lost them all. But the Buffalo Bills have had a great side in the past as well, and they've had some great players. But the Buffalo Sabres, that lack of playoff appearances in a row, 11 straight seasons, is got to be troubling. If that was a Carolina or an Arizona or a Florida or another team that they say moved the team, that was one of the teams in the non-traditional US markets, the calls would be move the team, relocate the team, relocate the team. Because Buffalo is in a traditional winter sports market and it's a traditional location near Ontario and Quebec on the US-Canadian border, in that kind of hockey heartland of the US, there's no calls to relocate the team. But if that was Arizona going through a lengthy spell, Carolina was as well at one point, calls were move the team sucks, move the team, relocate the team, relocate the team. But if you relocate that franchise, you're just relocating failure to a new location. It doesn't change the situation with how, over a decade, the team has sucked. The team they have really messed up the squad management, the direction, and it's like looking at Everton and Man United in the English Premier League, and the situation they're finding themselves in, where they just can't win any silverware, they can't be successful, they're getting worse. It's like Everton haven't won a trophy since 1995, and Liverpool went with 30 years without winning the league title. They won other trophies in that period, which kept the success coming, and they were winning other trophies. So there were there was trophies coming in. They were making finals. They were winning trophies. They didn't win the league for 30 years. 30 years without league success. Man City went, I think, was it 36 or 38 years without a trophy? After a while, fans will get frustrated. There will be questions asked about the direction the team is taking. The fact it's 11 seasons with no playoffs in an American franchise system. If that was another team in a non-traditional market, the calls would be relocate the team. The team sucks, move them. And we've had those calls with Arizona and Carolina and Florida. But there's not been the calls to Buffalo. Now has become a joke. It's become an online joke. You look at social media and it's, well, we're not going to make the playoffs next year. The fans have now got to the point where they are ashamed to be a Buffalo fan, and they take the humour and go, yeah, we're not making the playoffs. The fans are already resigned to the fact that they're not going to make the playoffs. I don't know how you fix the situation. Is it a GM move that needs to be done? Is it a coaching move, a coaching and GM move? I mean, imagine if Lou Lamoriello and Barry Trotz go to Buffalo. They would be a playoff side. Is it coaching? Is it recruitment? Is it draft problems? Is it in the prospects? You know, is it lack of veterans in the team? They have been a bad team for a very, very long time. In squad depth, the fact they traded Jack Eichel after the effort they went into to basically acquire the first overall pick, which was Conor McDavid in 2015, the tank for McDavid, and they get the second overall pick, which is not a bad, and they got Rasmus Dahlin. So they've had some good draft picks in Buffalo. But then that's it. Then they're not making progress and getting better. Question marks have to be asked. Yeah, it's not the Aquilinis. Who is it? I forget who owns the Buffalo Sabres. It's not the Aquilinis. The Aquilinis own Vancouver. But that lack of playoff appearances, let alone playoff success. They haven't been in the playoffs since before my daughter was born. It's true. They have got worse. They've reached rock bottom. They've got a second overall and a first overall. Oh, the Pegulas, that's the one. Pegulas. Hang on a sec. Who's this? Hello, buddy. You back home all right? Can I phone you back in about 5 minutes? All right, mate. All right, bye. I think, well, sorry about that. I do think that the Pegulas, you misspelled Pegula, by the way, they are going to face a lot more pressure next season. That is an enviable record. Even Arizona and Carolina, and they had lengthy spells with no playoffs, have had more recent playoff appearances and won rounds, and Carolina are now a regular playoff side. And Arizona, apart from this season, the last couple of seasons, they've been in the playoffs. So other bad teams, Florida, look like not only could they make they could actually win a round this time for the first time since 1996. Columbus, have swept Tampa a couple of years ago. Other teams that have also been historically bad have not been this bad and have reasonable. They've won playoff series and they've made playoffs and they've had some good playoff series and they've and the talk suddenly goes away when there's a little bit of success. There has to be questions now of the owners. There has to be questions over the direction and the culture within that locker room, because the fact that they've had a second overall draft pick and a first overall draft pick, they've traded one of their franchise players away. Some of the other players they've traded away have gone on to win the Stanley Cup or make the playoffs, individual awards. I thought it had an I in it. Pegula. Oh, okay. It's an interesting Italian name. Pegulia, but Pegula. I think the pressure now goes on the owners, because they're the ones who appoint the GM. They're the ones who also have a say on the coaching setup, the GM setup. So they appoint the GM. The GM will obviously have some input on who the coach is going to be. But also the owners are the ones, discussing with the GM how much money he's got to spend on, the salary cap. they're bankrolling this failure. There has to come a point where fans do start staying away in Buffalo, and there's a lot of because the fans keep turning up, and there's got to come a point where Toronto were like this for years, and they still are because they can't get out of the first round. Toronto have been like this for a long time. They're good in the regular season, and then the playoffs come and they can't get out the first round. They can't win a game seven. But I think Toronto can go on a playoff run this year. I'm hoping I'm not proved wrong on that one. But Toronto, the Maple Leafs fans keep turning up season after season, even when the team's bad. Buffalo fans keep turning up season after season, even though, you know, the team's bad. How long does the fan base continue to turn up in the numbers it does, and before they really start staying away and going, enough's enough, we want change? Because until the owners are hitting their bottom line, where they're not making as much profit on ticket sales, because Buffalo is a small market. Let's remember that it's not the biggest market in the US. It is heavily reliant on the Canadian fans coming across the border over the Niagara to you know with its catchment area into southern Ontario and parts of Quebec. It's a dual national fan base if you think about it. How long before change happens? Because this cannot continue with the mediocrity to utter diabolical seasons. Now they're not the worst team in the league right now. They're far from the worst team in the league. That's a Montreal award this year because Arizona have won more games, and Arizona have shown more fight in games. Montreal have been dreadful. They're far from the worst team in the league this season. But Montreal made a Stanley Cup final last year. They've had just a write-off of the season for various reasons. Arizona have been in a couple of playoff series in recent years. And since Buffalo last made the playoffs, they've made a conference final. Bear that in mind. Yes, since Buffalo last made the playoffs, Arizona have been in the playoffs more than once and made a conference final in that period in 2012. So another team that's also been in a similar funk with a lack of playoff appearances have actually had, I think, 3 playoff appearances in the time since Buffalo had none and made a conference final in that period. Carolina, lengthy spell outside the playoffs, had the record for the worst playoff drought, are now making conference finals and second rounds and challenging and being classed as a contender. Florida, well, they can't win a round at the moment. The last 4 or 5 years, they become a dominant regular season force and making the playoffs. They've got to win a round. Columbus have finally won a round in their existence and swept Tampa Bay. Winnipeg, from the Atlanta Thrashers, made the playoffs once in Atlanta. Have been regular playoff appearances since 2015, regularly. I think we're going to miss this season. They've had a couple of seasons without, but they've been regularly in and around the playoffs, made a conference final. Another franchise with a really poor playoff history. Edmonton are going to make the playoffs this year. They've had a pretty diabolical run in the playoffs as well, but they've started to make the playoffs more regularly now and being in contention. Calgary are up and down. The Senators have had some good playoff runs, even though they've had a lack of playoff success and have been poor the last few seasons. The fan base is expecting that, but they made a conference final not that long ago. Toronto are now regularly making the playoffs. Of course, they can't get out the first round, but they're regularly in the playoff contention in the top 3 in their division. So teams that have also had really poor lack of playoff appearances in recent last 10, 15 years are still better than them. They went into full tanking mode in 2015 and they've never come out. And while they're not the worst team in the league right now and they've only just been eliminated from playoff contention, they can't now mathematically make it. It's still troubling that in the last 11 years, they were mediocre. Okay, we're on the edge, we're on the cusp. And then, oh, no, we're not going to just tear it all down. And they've never come out of that rebuild because they're still always rebuilding. At which point does this rebuild end and you go, right, okay, now we have a team to compete and make the playoffs? Because they've had some good runs of form in the regular season and it goes wrong. They've had some good runs of form and they win consecutive games and they go on a run. And you're thinking this could be the year, and then it's not. So I don't know how you fix the Buffalo Sabres. I really don't. I could rant about them for a long time, but they are underachieving for what they are. They have an unenviable record for lack of playoff appearances. for 11 straight seasons. That I don't know. My dream all-time NHL defensive pairing be? Oh God, Dustin Buffalo would have to be in there because he's just a machine. Um, God, prime Dustin Buffalo. So 2015 to 2018 Dustin Buffalo, because that's just an animal. Um, with Chris Pronger and Dustin Buffalo in their prime would be my ideal defensive first pair. That's what I'm going to say on that. That's my ideal defensive pairing. Pronger and Buffalo, because they will just demolish people and score goals, and be clutch goal scorers, and both of them can actually play in the forwards as well if you need to. That's my ideal top pairing. Nicholas Cromwell does not make it in my top pairing. Sorry, too injury prone. Too injury prone. But no, Chris Pronger and Dustin Buffalo for me is my ideal when they were at their peak. I know Pronger is a little bit before Buffalo, but that would be my ideal pairing. That would be generally, if that was your first pair, Jesus Christ, they're going to cause, and they could play big minutes as well. I think Buffalo at one point was doing 25 to 30 minutes per game in the 2017-2018 season. He was averaging about 27 minutes per game. He was one of the highest minutes per game average. I think one game he played 36 minutes, so that's without overtime. So that's scary. And then Ben Sherratt came into his own that year, and unfortunately, obviously, fast forward, salary cap. Buffalo, obviously with his injury, decided to retire, and Sherratt obviously ended up at the Montreal Canadiens, which I think is a big loss to our defence core, which is I think weaker now than what it was in 2018. We 2019 we decided to trade the defence away, so we had one defenseman. We had 6 defensemen. We now have 1, and I think that's hampered the team going forward. Is our weaker defence core? Our forward depth is there. Defence depth is where, as a Jets fan, I'm concerned that Cheveldayoff has mismanaged that badly. And so in 2019, we're like, okay, we've been knocked out in the first round by the eventual Stanley Cup champions. We're going to trade our defence away. So the 2019-2020 season, we didn't have a defence. I was like, what are we doing? I just was completely, what's happened in the off season? My friend Sam, who's a Rangers fan, was like, "Where's your defence gone?" He's like, "You've got some of it. We don't have any. We have one defenseman. Who we have one defenseman. As of the free agency, we had one defenseman. I was like, we traded our defence away. We don't have any. And while some of the players that we brought in, their game went up and they did do their best. We are, I think, in my mind, I'm not sold on our defence core depth. And then we've traded some of our depth defensemen as well. And I'm just like, not sold. The forward grouping, I'm sold on. Goaltending, I'm sold on. I prefer Brossoit over Comrie, but as a backup. But our defence core has been decimated in the last couple of years, and I blame that on Cheveldayoff. I think that's the issue with Cheveldayoff as GM. I think that's the reason why I think we need a new GM and we need to strengthen that defence core. And we've made a terrible mistake letting go of a lot of our defensemen, quite frankly. Anyway, I'm going to call that a day. Thank you very much for all your questions. Really appreciate it. I have got a lot of things to do now this evening to get ready for work tomorrow. I really appreciate all your questions. And I'll have some more videos for you very, very soon.